Hey everybody, welcome to Friends List. I am Brian Crecente, the news editor of Polygon, and we are joined today by Michael McWhertor, the deputy news editor of Polygon. And today we're going to be speaking about BattleCry. What is BattleCry is what we're wondering. And Mike, I know you saw this game, what was it, a week ago, 2 weeks ago?
I guess it's 2 weeks ago now, yeah.
Oh,
Let me tell you what BattleCry is, Brian.
Please do.
Let me answer the question, what is BattleCry?
Thank you.
BattleCry is the first game from BattleCry Studios. That's the company or the studio that Bethesda established in like mid to late 2012. It was founded by Rich Vogel. He's one of the key people there, and he's a former BioWare Austin, former Sony Online Entertainment guy who worked on their Star Wars online role-playing games. And BattleCry is their first effort. It's this 32-player multiplayer online action game that, when you first look at it, looks a lot like Team Fortress 2 because it's got a very stylized, class-based setup to it, but it differentiates itself, at least in one major way, in that there are no real traditional guns or grenades or rocket launchers or machine guns or anything like that in the game. It's mostly a mix of kind of melee and ranged attacks, and those ranged attacks are kind of like energy weapons or bows and arrows and crossbows and bolts. And so it's kind of like Team Fortress 2 with swords. That's like the most reductive way I can talk about it. But it's the creative director on it is Victor Antonov, and you might know him from his work on Half-Life 2 and Dishonored. He's a pretty interesting artist, and he's kind of leading the charge on this game from a creative standpoint, and he's got some interesting approaches to how they're kind of designing the look of the world. And that's basically like the gist of it. But it is a free-to-play multiplayer game, kind of like Team Fortress 2 again. But I think that they're trying to approach it from a slightly different angle in terms of how they monetize it. We don't really know too much about that yet. But yeah, that's kind of the gist of it. And I played it for, I don't know, 20 minutes or so.
So like for me, Team Fortress 2, obviously it has a very specific look, but for me, the thing that really sets Team Fortress 2 apart from other games of its kind is the sort of the flow of the game. How smooth it is and how it sort of feels when you're playing it. Does this have that same sort of feel?
It definitely has a different feel from Team Fortress 2, for sure. When we played it, I think, when I played it with a bunch of journalists in Santa Monica a couple weeks ago, we were all kind of coming to grips with just learning how to play it for the first time. And, basically, I think we all kind of discovered that it's really advantageous to move in packs in this game because there's so much melee focus. And it was interesting because, like, as we kind of moved through it, we moved through one of the levels. I think it was called Fracture. They actually don't call them levels; they call them war zones, which are their maps. But yeah, we were moving basically in this like pack of sword wielding characters, and like as soon as we would lay eyes on someone, we would just all go after them. So it definitely has a kind of a different play style from Team Fortress 2 because it's so melee focused. But I will couch that by saying we only played 3 of the game's classes. Like Team Fortress 2, I think has eight or 9. I can't remember. I think it's 9. But this only had 3 that were playable, and they were a melee class that uses a big sword, a melee class that uses 2 smaller swords and moves a lot faster, and an archer who uses a bow and arrow or a pair of crossbows. So we didn't really get to see how gameplay would be affected by some of the other announced classes that they have. One is a gadgeteer, which is essentially an engineer who builds gadgets and I would assume like turrets and things like that. And,
right.
And the other one is the brawler, which is like another melee class, which doesn't use weapons, like doesn't use handheld weapons. He or she uses like the giant mechanical arms and mechanical and giant iron fists.
So,
So
the,
yeah, so we don't really have a great sense of how it's going to play ultimately when all the classes are in there.
right, right.
But what I played definitely felt different from TF2 in a lot of ways.
In terms of movement, was it sort of supposed to be pseudo realistic, or was it more cartoony? I kind of feel like Team Fortress 2 is a little cartoony in terms of you kind of float a little when you jump, and
Yeah.
does it have that feel, or how would you say the movement feels in the game?
The movement's really fast, for one thing. You're basically always sprinting unless you have your weapon out. So whenever you draw your weapon, which is, I think you would essentially draw your weapon whenever you would hit attack, and otherwise you would be running around with your weapon kind of sheathed, and so you're moving pretty fast. The other thing that they have in it is you can jump, but then you can also do this double jump that's kind of like a dive / evade move. So you're kind of running around, jumping around, and then if you hit jump while you're in the air, you'll do this like dive. Let me illustrate this dive for you with my hands. And I think that will help you kind of avoid enemy gunfire and just kind of mess up people's aim if they've got you in their sights. But they have another component to the movement, which are these kind of magnetic hooks on which you can target, and then you can they basically pull you towards them.
Huh.
And so yeah, you're kind of moving through this world not just by walking around and running around. You're also kind of tethering yourself to these targets that kind of pull you through the world as well, as you kind of move up and down on the various levels of the battlefield. So it definitely feels different from Team Fortress 2 again in that way, because it's a lot faster. It seems like maybe the classes all kind of move at the same speed,
Right.
but don't say that's confirmed.
In terms of the classes, I know you didn't get a chance to play all of them. They only had you with those three, but it feels to me like if I have a choice of being the person with a projectile weapon, be it this electromagnetic or whatever it is gun, or the crossbow, or a person who's really far away with a sword, I know which one of those I'm going to choose. Like, how are they balancing that?
You'd think that, wouldn't you?
I would. That's exactly what I just said.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
But I kind of started the game. I started off as an enforcer, which is a guy or a woman, depending on which faction you're in, who has this giant cleaver, like man-sized cleaver.
Right.
And that can also transform into this shield. So basically what it does is instead of this cleaver, you hold it up and it like kind of fans out into this metal shield, and you can hide yourself and teammates behind it. But I found that was actually a pretty capable class. So then when I switched to the archer to try her out, I found myself at kind of a disadvantage, because movement in the game is really fast, and you can kind of close that distance between yourself and somebody who's a range class pretty quickly.
Right. Right.
And trying to get a bead on someone, I found while being an archer is pretty tough. So
and then once they close that distance, they can get all stabby with you, and you're kind of screwed, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, the archers do have kind of a closer range attack, which is they can throw these little daggers at you, so they can kind of keep moving around. But the archer also has another advantage in that he or she can use this thing called, I think it's called enemy sight or something like that. Basically, they can see through walls. So they can see if if they use a special ability of theirs, whether someone's coming at them or not. So they have an advantage there. But it is kind of tough to get a bead on someone and hit them with a bow and arrow when they're about 6 feet in front of you.
Right.
And yeah, you can close those distances pretty quickly, especially if you're with another player character who might have a ranged attack. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. It feels like there's probably a pretty good balance there. But it's a little early to tell on something like that.
So this sounds a little bit not in its aesthetic or certainly its backstory, but in terms of the idea of it being more of a melee based, a melee class based game. Actually, I forgot to
Hmm.
ask: is this first person or third person?
It's third person.
It's third. Okay.
Yeah. Hmm.
So I'm a big fan of Chivalry Medieval Warfare,
Yeah.
which
Right. Right.
is first person, I believe. I think that's right. I
Hmm.
think it's first person. And it is a game that on many levels sounds like there's some similarities. There are a couple of these games coming out now. Vikings is another where basically you are playing during this time period before weapons. I'm sorry, before black powder, before guns. And so you can either choose, depending on which game you're playing, you could choose essentially someone with a sword or knife or an axe, or someone with
Hmm.
a bow and arrow. And they've built up a lot of modes that are very similar to Team Fortress. One of the things that makes these games, I think, makes or breaks them, is the melee attack, the hit detection on those on the game. It's essentially it's as
Yeah.
important. I think hit detection in these games is as important as it is in something like Street Fighter. Because while it's not as technical as Street Fighter, I think that a lot of those same strategies exist in terms of whiffing a swing with the sword and stuff like that. So were you able to play it enough to see if they had really worked out the nuance of that melee combat and if the hit detection system was locked in?
Actually felt pretty good to me, and I think that's one of the advantages of the game being third person. I think what they did was they really tried to take a look at games where you use, sword-based combat. And I'm pretty sure that they didn't come right out and say it, but I'm pretty sure they were referring to games like Devil May Cry or Ninja Gaiden, in which you feel like you have a good sense of the reach of your sword and what's going to connect with your target. And all that felt pretty good to me. Like I never really felt like I was whiffing necessarily, and a lot of that may be due to the fact that you have a lot of quick lunging attacks. Like each character class has its own kind of special abilities. So like the enforcer, I think can basically do a quick charge in the combat. Like you can target an opponent, and then you can press like the Q button or something like, or the Q key on your keyboard, and you'll basically do a rush attack at him or her, and so you can basically you're almost guaranteed to hit on those things. And then once you get up close, where you're like right next to each other, you can really just jam on like the left mouse button and then just wail on them with sword attacks, and then execute another special ability. Like the enforcer has one in which he basically turns into this whirlwind, like a walking blender, and just thrashes the other player with a spinning attack. And so you're basically doing those kinds of combinations of things. And yeah, all that felt pretty good. Like it didn't necessarily feel as tight and structured as something like a Ninja Gaiden or Devil May Cry, but it definitely had that flavor where you do feel like you're engaged in like some pretty good combo based attacks with an opponent.
So, in terms of the attacks themselves, again, speaking of games like Chivalry, you have I think you can attack from above, from below. You can attack side to side. You can parry attacks. It's all very, frankly, it's a little convoluted, but it's a lot of fun because you really have to
Yeah.
be careful about how you're doing your attacks. Is this basically kind of like using a gun where you basically point at the person, push a button, and it does a swing, and the swing's always the same, or how does that work?
I don't think it's as technical as what you're talking about in something in like Chivalry. There's not that level of finesse. I think, I would basically think of it more along the lines of like there are a lot of games that are starting to feel more and more to me like they are drawing influence from games like League of Legends or Dota, where
Oh, right.
you're basically clicking on another character to attack them, but then you're also performing special attacks um, that have cooldowns that you have to kind of manage those, and then also use them to their advantage, so that you're always doing some kind of series of attacks.
Right.
And chaining those together in a game like BattleCry really requires knowing kind of your class and what the cooldown times are like, and what the most effective thing to do is at the right time, because another player might be able to kind of get out of the way of your attack, and then you're going to be left there like spinning around like a top, you know, with like totally vulnerable to whatever attack they want to pile onto you after that.
So more tactical than action or skill based.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like that I don't think that there's a lot of like skill required in terms of dexterity in pulling off some of these attacks. I think it's more just like knowing what your class is capable of, and just like I found that it was better for me to kind of keep my opponent off guard and just keep like being really aggressive with them with some of the classes, and that was kind of the approach that I took. It wasn't necessarily technical like chivalry or something like that, and definitely not as micromanagey as a like a game like League of Legends or Dota, but yeah, there's definitely some flavor there from a bunch of different genres.
So I'm very interested in sort of the backstory here for two reasons. One, just the time period. Would you say this is essentially World War One but without gunpowder, or like what time period do you think this is supposed to take place?
So yeah, basically it is. So this is kind of like a parallel universe, where after some war that is maybe not World War One, the world's superpowers basically come to an agreement that after the devastation and chaos that was caused by a previous war, that we should really ban gunpowder, and because it just leads to so much destruction and so many civilian casualties that are not related to the war. So they have this treaty, and in the wake of that treaty, there's this event called the Pan-Sophic Revolution, which is basically this golden era of technology and design and innovation. But after a while, like certain conflicts arise, and the wars continue. And what they do is they adhere to this no gunpowder rule, which is maybe a little bit silly, but
hey, we have a no nukes rule right now, so maybe.
Well, yeah, sure, right, yeah. So things like traditional guns, gunpowder, bombs, chemical and nuclear and atomic weapons are all banned. So basically, everybody fights with in these arenas with like swords and energy weapons and things like that. And yeah, they basically, instead of fighting wars on any battleground, they have these designated battlegrounds called war zones, and that's where each faction's best soldiers come to fight, and that's how they settle their differences, basically.
So you, in interviewing some of the developers, one of them mentioned something about how, and maybe I misunderstood this, but it sounded like he was saying that the perception of the arena might change to soldiers who are on the losing side because of what he called the horrors of war. Is that the best way of summarizing that?
Yes, and so one of the other reasons this kind of ties into the World War I era is because Viktor Antonov, who's the creative director on this game, I think he wanted to explore some of the psychological trauma that's associated with trench warfare.
Right.
And so one of the things that's interesting that he told me about was that when you're close to death or when your team is on the verge of losing, some of the environmental factors are going to change. And I didn't really notice this when I was playing it, but like the sky, the clouds, the wind, the sun, those things are going to kind of slightly alter to let you know that things are going very badly for you. And where did he say this? He said that this was actually kind of tied to what soldiers would see when they were in the battlefield, when they were in trench warfare, like, under fire.
So like emotionally traumatic things that essentially alter your perception. That's interesting.
I think he, he's real big on symbolism.
Right.
And so like, I think some of the things that he mentioned, you might see like crows in the sky as you're approaching death, or
a murder
or you're
of
on
crows.
The verge of losing. A murder of crows.
Right.
So things like that. you know, those were things I didn't really see, and unfortunately, you know, they haven't released any real gameplay of the game yet. We really only have that one pre-rendered trailer to go by.
Right.
But yeah, I'm really interested to see how that all kind of pans out, because you know they're talking about how they're influenced by kind of early 20th century illustration and you know, propaganda art of the era, which is a little bit more heroic than some of the things we might see in World War II and later wars.
Right.
Yeah, but it's interesting because, you know, Antonov talked about how they wanted to kind of tap into some of those more ritualized structures of war and violence in the past, about how, you know, like how duels were very structured in the
Right.
1700s and 1800s. You know, that there were they had their own rules, that they were attended by witnesses and physicians and things like that. And you know, future wars just kind of went a little chaotic, and this is more trying to basically have a worldwide duel, as it were.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and World War One is an interesting choice because it is in many
Yeah.
ways the death of wartime honor. The idea that you would have honorable fighting, and instead it was more like do whatever you need to do to win.
Yeah.
I like also that you mentioned in the story this idea of being able to salute one another after the game's over and bestow awards on the other team and medals, which is
Yeah.
I mean I like the notion. I don't know how well it's going to take off. Going back to Chivalry, talking about Chivalry, it's interesting because Chivalry is a game that was designed mostly for I think my impression is it was designed mostly for the multiplayer structured modes, the co-op modes where you would have team-based gameplay where they were trying to accomplish things. And what would happen is people would go into these sort of free-for-all matches where it's supposed to be a bunch of, you know, deathmatch basically. And what happened was there were people who would decide, instead of all running around trying to kill each other, they would literally pair off in twos and do a duel, and everybody would watch. And this was all created by the players. It wasn't something that the game modes actually supported. And the players would literally, without texting or talking, would just, there's a way you could salute in the game. So they would salute each other. They'd have a duel, and then when one died, the next person would come up. And to me, that was really fascinating because it wasn't something designed into the game, but it was something
Yeah.
that, for whatever reason, gamers like to do. What I don't know is if you're trying to introduce it without the gamers sort of organically coming up with it, if it's going to be accepted. Do you feel like, were you able to do that in the matches you guys played?
Yeah, and let me tell you, I thought that the idea was really great. I thought the implementation wasn't really there from what I saw, because basically what happens at the end of a match is everybody stops fighting, and they you know, they kind of just run around, they cluster up, and then you'll start to see little accolades appear over people's heads, like, you know, this person got the most kills, this person did the most damage, this person had this combo or something like that. So there are these certain rewards, basically, or awards that are given to a handful of players, and maybe it's like 3 or 4. And what you can do is you can basically just, what happens after that kind of just like everybody running around moment is that these newspapers basically appear on the screen, and they detail some of the accolades that people are being awarded and call out certain players. And then you basically press a key on the keyboard to either salute them, and then you also have the option to give out, I think you only have 1 medal per round that you can give to another player. So you can salute them, and that's like, hey, good job. And then you can, if somebody does something particularly outstanding, you can award them a medal. And I believe you can collect those medals and then trade them in for something later on. But yeah, the implementation was basically, I didn't really feel like there was any real sense of community or camaraderie after it. It was basically like, let's get through this portion of the experience. I'll press all the keys and give away my medal. But I didn't really feel like I was actively engaged in any of that, or that, and when I did receive a medal, that it was all that rewarding. So, you know, that may be something that's still in the works. I mean, the game isn't going to be out for a while. They're not even going into beta until sometime next year.
Right.
And yeah, I don't know. It's a good idea. I just don't know that the implementation is there quite yet. I think the more interesting thing is the war effort, which is that kind of global war that players are going to fight each other in, and how that kind of affects your friends' faction and your guilds. So yeah, I think that there's some smart ideas in this game, but yeah, I think like you, the kind of honor and community part of it is not really there yet.
Well, this sounds very interesting. We had some questions. I sent out a tweet asking people for questions. I think we answered most of them, though. Sean Allen, you know Sean Allen. We both know Sean Allen, developer, asked this question, which is interesting. Will there be any visual character customization, like skin color, gender, etc.? Like, can I be a black woman brawler? So I wanted you to answer that, but also it was interesting because it sounded like you were saying on some level gender had something to do with which team you were on. So can you explain that?
Yeah. So, there are two factions that they've revealed. One is the Cossack Empire and the other is the British Royal Marines. And so like the enforcer on the British Royal Marine side is by default, I think, a man. At least that's what it was in the demo that we played. On the Cossack side, she's a woman. And that I think that gender switch is the same for the tech archer in what we played. I don't think we've seen a female brawler necessarily. I think if you look at the trailer, maybe they have some of that in there. But yes, you will be able to unlock genders that are not the default, from what I understand. So basically, in the game, as you fight, you earn the in-game currency, which is called iron, and you can use that to buy new armor pieces, new helms, because everybody loves hats in their free-to-play multiplayer games.
Yes.
And I'm pretty sure you can buy customizations like skins and other genders. They didn't really show us any of that, and I don't remember seeing any people of color in the artwork or the trailers. It all looks pretty much like people are Caucasian. But I have to believe that they would implement that because it's the right thing to do. And if they can get away with selling other ethnicities for money,
heck yeah,
they might do it.
So, but your understanding though is that you can customize the look of your character through unlocking.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that customization is going to be a big part of it, and that was one of the things that Antonov was talking about. It's like there's such a rich aesthetic to that era and that style that you can do a lot of things with that. So I would expect that you're going to see a lot of variation in that game, which is good.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate it. Yeah. And thank you, everybody, for watching us. We've been talking about BattleCry, which is a game that was just announced coming out sometime next year, if all things come together. Make sure you check us out tomorrow for another episode of Friends List.